In philosophy, as in so many other respects, it's now the United States rather than Britain that is the chief centre of activity in the English-speaking world. But there's been American philosophy of international importance for 100 years now. In fact, Bertrand Russell, in his autobiography, describes the Harvard School of Philosophy as having been the best in the world during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. American philosophy of that period is represented above all by three figures who have since attained classic status: C.S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. They are sometimes given a group label, the American Pragmatists, but in fact they are more different from each other than that might suggest. C.S. Peirce was born in 1839, the son of a professor of mathematics at Harvard. He was trained from the beginning as a mathematician and scientist, and his paid jobs were as astronomer and physicist. Philosophy was something he did in his spare time, until at the age of 48 he retired to devote himself to it entirely. But this, I'm afraid, led to his being sunk in poverty and debt by the time he died in 1914 at the age of 74. He never wrote a book, and a great deal of his work came out only posthumously, when his collected papers were published in 8 volumes. A near contemporary of Peirce was William James, born in 1842 and also educated at Harvard, from which he graduated in medicine. James became a Harvard lecturer in anatomy and physiology, then after that professor of philosophy, and then after that professor of psychology. Among his best-known books are The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, and Pragmatism, published in 1907. Died in 1910. Unlike Peirce, he received international recognition during his lifetime. In this context, it's interesting to mention that the novelist Henry James was one of his brothers, and Henry, for part, if not most of his life, felt himself under the shadow of world-famous elder brother William. The third and most recent of our three classical American philosophers was John Dewey, who was born in 1859 and lived until 1952. He spent the whole of his career as a university teacher, first at the University of Michigan, then in Chicago, and finally at Columbia, New York. Few philosophers of any place or time have had such widespread influence on practical and public affairs. His philosophy of education alone can be said to have had worldwide impact, and he was influential in other fields as well. It's difficult to pick a few books from so copious an output, but perhaps I might mention Democracy and Education, published in 1916, Human Nature and Conduct, published in 1922, Experience and Nature, published in 1925, and The Quest for Certainty, published in 1929. To discuss the work of Dewey, James, and Peirce, I've invited Sidney Morgenbesser, Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University in New York. Now let's start right at the beginning of the story. The first of these people in time was Peirce, and it was him who introduced the term pragmatism as a philosophical term. And he introduced it first of all as a maxim for meaning, didn't he? Can you explain exactly what that meant?
Well, it was a maxim for clarification of certain kinds of terms, which are called intellectual terms.
Yes.
It was not necessarily a theory of meaning for all terms or how to analyze all terms. That he also dealt with in a later book, but in this essay, it was primarily a theory of how one analyzes specific terms or specific ideas, or if you wish, sentences in which these terms are embedded. He was motivated to try to tell someone how he can be clear as his ideas, sort of an approach to give rules for clarification, so that if an agent acts, he at least knows the beliefs clearly upon which he acts. That's the motivation in the background.
Now, what was the pragmatic criterion of meaning? What was that?
Well, I can give it by illustration. You consider the practical effects of the concept, as it were. But let me sort of begin with an example and then see whether we can build up from examples.
Right.
Let's say if I asked you what you meant when you said something, sugar is soluble in water, I presume you would mean that if I or anyone put the sugar in water, it dissolved. Here, to get clearly in mind what you mean, you would specify, if you wish, some conditional as to what would happen, or what kind of consequences would happen, or what actions or habits the particular entity has that you could activate, as it were, by your action.
It relates the meaning of the concept to an actual or possible action, or event, or occurrence.
Yes. The meaning would be specified in this conditional.
Right.
So that Now, if you take a particular sentence in the indicative, like this particular hammer is hard, or whatever we will attribute the predicate hard, here's in the indicative, and the Peircean view is, well, you should be able to translate the indicative into these kinds of conditionals. If it were not possible for you, you really wouldn't have a clear concept of mind. Well, it's just hard, hard, hard. And you would then suggest, or he would suggest, to try to clarify the specific kinds of things that if the particular entity was acted upon, some particular observable consequence would happen in terms of scratching or what would...
So to bring it down to ordinary speech, what Peirce is saying is that for certain kinds of concept to be meaningful, then their application in reality must make an observable difference to something. If they don't make an observable difference to anything, then they don't have real content.
Yes, but these are conditionals. They would be.
That's right.
Now,
yes.
This would be is not necessarily a statement that it has carried out.
No. It's about meaning. It's not about occurrence. If
and
I placed it in water, it would
This
dissolve.
is only for the clarification of certain terms.
Right. I want to push the discussion a little further along, because although Peirce made this a very substantial contribution to theory of meaning, he wasn't concerned with theory of meaning in a sort of scholastic way, was he? He wasn't concerned with it in isolation. For him, it was all part of a much more general concern with science. I emphasized in my introduction to this discussion how Peirce the man was all his life a working scientist. That's what he was, and he was a logician, and he was concerned to clarify concepts, clarify statements, clarify beliefs as part of a much wider scientific enterprise whose aim was to understand the world and to acquire new knowledge, wasn't it?
Yes.
Can you put it in that context for us?
Well, first I'll amplify some of the remarks about the meaning that you suggested. He said he learned these habits in the laboratory. That's how scientists get clear about his terms. And
yes.
In the 20th century, some people thought that one clarifies terms in that way, which is called operational definitions. You know when to apply. If certain things are done by you, then these and these would be the observational consequences. But that's the background, and we now go to the other topic you've introduced, the notion of inquiry.
Right.
And I think we could begin first with Peirce.
And by inquiry, of course, you simply mean finding out about the world, both in common sense terms and more organizedly in scientific terms.
Right.
Yes.
And sort of testing the hypothesis in a suitable way, collecting the hypothesis in a suitable way, having certain rules to tell you when the hypothesis or the inference is a well-formed inference, that when the conclusion follows...
It's the whole nuts and bolts substructure of science that we're talking about.
But now I think one could begin first with sort of a theorist of ordinary beliefs, or the ordinary believer, and taking the notion of belief now for granted, Peirce frequently gives the following picture. I say picture because this isn't quite a full presentation, and suggests this picture to a lot of people, that normally we can sort of go along and rely on our beliefs, and then when we run into a problematic situation, one has to have a strategy for how to revise one's beliefs. And there he begins with possible strategies that one could follow. The method of tenacity, you pick some beliefs and just stick to it. The method of authority, you go to an authority, tell you what to believe. And he gives some reasons why one shouldn't rely on those methods. They're self-defeating. But now the better method is to engage in inquiry and to try to find out by inquiry which particular kind of belief, which is under test, is better than its competitors by actual testing in accord with certain principles. And, now, when he does this particular view, he presents another theory of how one justifies the beliefs. Thus far, we've talked about the motivation. We engage in inquiry in order to fix our beliefs, and we have to come to a rational decision that we have a right to accept this belief rather than a competitor.
In order to act on it and base further work on it.
Well, to have some particular rules in the background to form well-formulated beliefs about the nature of the world, and then given utilities you act. He's not telling you what you should act for. That's part of the ethics and the aesthetics. But now, if by hypothesis one goes a little further, the following picture, once again, is frequently presented as being relevant to Peirce. While we test some beliefs, we're holding some beliefs constant. And then while we're holding some belief constants in one context, we can subject them to check in another context. And the sort of the rationality behind it is this sort of self-correcting process. And we don't have to begin with premises which are certain and indubitable upon which we sort of build our knowledge.